Hi, everyone. Today we have Bailey Flanigan speaking in our seminar. Bailey is currently a fourth-year PhD student at CMU, where she is advised by Ariel Procaccia. Bailey's work uses techniques from theoretical computer science and artificial intelligence to design more effective democratic processes, such as citizens' assemblies. She's also interested in practice-driven questions related to online learning and algorithms with prediction. And outside of research, Bailey is passionate about equitable education, and she led the CS Jedi project at CMU. And today she'll tell us about altruism and voting.
Cool. All right. Thank you, Saeed. And thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I think there's several people in the audience here who I've always wanted to talk to, or I've run into at posters before. So anyway, today we're going to be thinking about the power of altruism in collective decisions. More broadly, I hope that this talk kind of makes you think about democracy and how we should design it. And so that's kind of I'll try to give a little bit of high level scope while also talking at a low level about some of the specific research that I've been doing. I was already introduced, so I'll skip the details, but yeah, feel free to chime in with questions. I can't see all of you, so if I'm not taking your question, just interrupt me because I can't see the little hand thing. Okay, so we're going to start by just sort of defining what we mean by a collective decision-making process, because we're going to talk about a couple different collective decision-making processes today. So when we say collective decision-making process, the collective refers to the fact that there's a group of constituents, like a population. These aren't decision makers, but they're people who are going to be affected by the decisions made by their society. And we're going to call them voters in this talk. We're going to be making a decision over some alternatives, and we're going to discretize the space of possible outcomes. So we're going to think of them as A, B, C, D alternatives. And voters are not divorced from this decision. They stand to gain or lose, depending on which alternative gets chosen in the decision. And we measure how much they stand to gain or lose with utilities. The higher the utility, the more people stand to gain. And then we're going to run a collective decision process. And the first key feature of a collective decision process is that it takes in some information from the voters. Maybe it takes in some features, maybe it takes in voter submitted preferences, whatever. And then it's going to make a decision, and it's only going to be able to select one possible alternative out of all the alternatives, and this alternative will then affect everyone. And this is a really important feature of a collective decision process, and it differs from other kinds of processes whose social impact we care about. If you think about a prediction algorithm, it's also going to take in information from people, but it's going to output a personalized decision for everyone. And so the considerations that we think about are much different. Here, we can only pick one thing. And so we're essentially, after we choose an outcome, we're going to evaluate its quality by looking at the column of the utility matrix corresponding to that alternative. And the measure that we're going to use in this talk, although you can think of several different kinds of measures, is the average utility, which is essentially just the utilitarian social welfare. Okay, and so then if we want to say, okay, how good is our process in this example? We're going to look at the competitive ratio. We're going to say, okay, what is the best possible average utility we could have gotten? And we're going to divide that by the average utility of the outcome that we chose. And this is probably the inverse of the competitive ratio that you would normally think about. If this is larger, things are getting worse. And that's really just because of what is standard in the literature, and also the math will work out better. So just think more distortion, things are worse. And in general, we think about this competitive ratio as a worst case. So if we're evaluating a collective decision process, we're going to look at the worst possible input that could have happened in the process. Okay, make sense? This is going to be true throughout the talk. Okay, just chime in if you're confused. Okay, so in this talk, we're going to talk about 3 different collective decision processes, and they're going to build on each other. And they're all going to serve different purposes. So the first one is the canonical one. We're going to talk about voting. And the purpose of talking about this is that we're going to talk about a concerning example that will happen when we only use voting. And this will really motivate the next slightly more complicated collective decision processes that we're going to analyze. The focus of this talk will be on deliberative democracy, which I'll explain. But really, this will be the meat of the talk. And it's going to talk about how, under the condition of altruistic behavior of voters, voting will work a lot better than it does in the general case that we're going to see in the first part. And then finally, this work on deliberation is going to motivate some experiments. And I think citizens' assemblies, a third type of process, is a really natural way to run these experiments. And this is part of like work that I've done in the past also, so we can like briefly touch on that if we're interested. But we're going to start by talking about voting. So just to give you a brief overview of the model, I'm going to go through an example that will make it much more clear. But basically, we have these voters, they have their utilities, and they're going to be asked to vote. And they're going to submit rankings over the alternatives. And they're going to rank alternatives based on the ordering of their utilities. So if voter I has higher utility for A than B, they're going to rank A ahead of B. And then we take this voting rule, which is a function from a set of all these rankings to a winner. And so you can think of, for example, like pick the thing that the most people rank first. That's a voting rule. In this case, it would be A. Okay. So let's talk about voting. This is like a pretty important setting to study because this is really pretty close to what we use in our standard day-to-day like democratic decision making often. And I'm going to walk you through a detailed example so that you can kind of understand why voting fails in some cases and whether or not we should really believe that this is just like a worst case cooked example versus a pattern that we should actually be really concerned about. Okay, so we have our neighborhood here, this contained within this circle, and the light gray dots are like people, that's where they live. And these gray buses are the existing bus stops in the neighborhood. And you can see that there's two regions of the neighborhood that are like really underserved by bus stops. And so the city says, okay, we have enough money to build one more bus stop in your neighborhood. And it's going to be at either location A or location B, and you're going to vote on where to put it. Okay, so let's talk about people's preferences in this situation. We're going to divide people up based on whether they're primarily served by bus stop A, bus stop B, or neither. And we're going to use these types to define people's utilities for the different alternatives. So people of type 1, and I'm going to tell you a little story to like justify their utilities. People of type 1, they tend to have cars, they are pretty wealthy, they don't take the bus. And so they're going to have a slight preference for A, but it's not going to be very strong. You can think of epsilon as like a really small number. People of type 2, in contrast, they don't have cars. They really rely on the bus for like getting to work, getting to school. And so they would have really high utility for getting a new bus stop in their neighborhood. And people of type 3, you think they will be indifferent because they're not really served by either of these new bus stops, but maybe they're like very slightly biased. Maybe it's because they're more like the people in the type 1 part of the neighborhood and they say, okay, well, I would never go to bus stop B, but I might go to bus stop A. They're going to have like a slight bias. And for the sake of this example, let's say they all do, although this example like is very robust, so we don't need them all to, but okay. Anyway, these are the utilities. And if we think about what's going to happen when people vote, the rankings that they're going to submit, 90% of people will rank A ahead of B. Okay. And any reasonable voting rule that sees these rankings is going to choose A because it sees that 90% of people prefer A over B, and it can't see the utilities. It can only see the ranking. Okay. Do we think that this is a good outcome? I would argue that it's not a good outcome, right? Okay, I'm seeing some people shaking their heads, and I don't think it is because we've chosen a bus stop that basically no one is going to use, right? The people of type 1, they don't take the bus. The people of type 3, even if they did, they wouldn't really use that bus stop. So we could have chosen something that would have been great for some people, and instead we chose something that no one is going to actually use. And this is captured in the average utility. We can see that the average sort of value generated for the population by A is almost 0, whereas the value generated by B would have been much higher. And we can evaluate the distortion, our competitive ratio in this case. We could have gotten average utility 1, but we got epsilon. And as these people of type 1 and type 3 become more and more indifferent, this ratio can become like unboundedly large. Okay. So what happened here? Like basically like everything, basically everything went right? Like everybody voted in the democracy. That's kind of what we want, right? Like we want everybody to participate. And our voting rule did something extremely sensible, which is that it chose the thing that everybody seemed to want. And the question is like, can we just change the voting rule? Like this is the question that I think a lot of voting theorists tend to ask. It's like, if we could just choose the right voting rule, like maybe this would be fine. Does anybody have any thoughts on like whether we can change the voting rule and avoid this problem? Feel free to chime in if you want. Okay, you don't have to chime in. Okay, I'll just tell you. You can't change the voting rule. There's nothing you can do. So all deterministic voting rules will have unbounded distortion. And you can see that basically in this really simple example, any voting rule that will choose the majority will have this problem. You can just flip the example slightly and break any voting rule that chooses the minority, which is just like a strictly worse voting rule in like many ways. Okay, and you might have questions about randomized rules. I would be happy to talk about those later, but there's real practical reasons why deterministic voting rules are really interesting in their own right, because it's really hard to like convince people that we should be making decisions based on randomized voting rules. So we're going to stick with deterministic voting rules for this talk. And so anyway, this is like kind of an alarming example in my opinion, because even though everything went right, we see that voting will just sometimes choose outcomes that like are kind of bad. And maybe you're thinking like, okay,
sorry, just out of curiosity,
Yeah,
is this solved by randomized voting rules, or we're just gonna not think about it because it's complicated?
Good question. So you can, so if you take the randomized voting rule that uniformly randomly chooses one of the alternatives, that just ignores everybody's preferences, that will give you it will give you a distortion of M, where M is the number of alternatives. Because with equal probability, you'll end up just choosing the highest like average utility alternative. With like,
sure.
So that, okay, yeah. So you can do it with like randomized rules, and there are smarter randomized rules that will also achieve that ratio.
Okay, so like random dictatorship gets a factor of the number of voters, which, you know, may or may not be better than 1 over epsilon. Is it possible to do better than that?
Is it possible to do better than M, the number of alternatives? No, under general utilities, like if you don't assume anything about the utilities, the best randomized rule can get M.
I see. So you can always get number of alternatives by picking a random alternative. You can always do as well as the number of bidders by picking, or number of voters by picking a random voter. And then if you're deterministic, you can't even do either of those.
I don't even think picking a random voter will give you 1 over the number of voters, because if you accidentally pick a voter that has really, really low, like maybe, okay, let's say in this election you picked a random voter and you chose, with pretty high probability, you're going to choose a voter of type 3. You're still going to get like basically no average utility out of their chosen winner.
Yeah, so, but 10% of the time you pick the voter of type 2.
Sure.
But like, I guess in general, right, like if the number of voters is smaller than the number of alternatives, then you can, right, then with probability 1 over the number of voters, you're picking whatever is the most preferred alternative, or maybe not. Anyway,
I'm not sure. I don't know. I have an example in mind that makes me think that you can't actually, it's not actually that important. In general, these elections have like a huge number of voters.
Yeah.
So, okay, but yeah, that's a good question. Randomized rules are like a different thing. And this is actually like in a paper that I'm writing right now. So I'm happy to take questions about this, but yeah, does this make sense? Okay, great. Okay. So you might be thinking, well, you cooked this example. Things are probably not really that bad. So there's some related work that does make some assumptions on the structure of voters' utilities that does get bounded distortion. And so we can look at those assumptions and see if they seem reasonable, and then maybe we'll conclude that this example is just really cooked. So let's in particular look at unit sum utilities, which is an assumption that basically says that every single voter will have the same sum of utilities across the alternatives. And as it should, this assumption removes this example, right? Because voters of type 1 and 3 have almost no total utility across the alternatives. And this assumption, we can't really promote this assumption because we can't really control how much people lose or gain from decisions. So we have to kind of ask ourselves, do we think that this condition already exists in the population? And like, just to answer that question, we can think about like why this really fixes the problem. So what went wrong in our example is that basically people of type 1 and type 3 versus type 2 have very different stakes in this decision. And what I mean by that is that like people of type 1 and 3 don't really stand to like lose or gain anything, whereas people of type 2 have really high stakes, like they really stand to gain or lose. But this information is lost in the process of going from utilities to rankings. And this problem is in some sense fixed by assuming unit sum utilities, because what that sort of enforces is that everybody has like approximately equal stakes in the problem. Like they all stand to gain about the same amount overall. And this is like a bit of a hand wavy idea, But really the fundamental problem here is this idea of different stakes. And I would argue that in real problems, voters do have different stakes in the decision. Like you can think about any policy decision, and you can think about a group of people that you pull from like a city. You can imagine that people will have really different stakes. And I think one really important way that this is true is that marginalized populations in many contexts will just have higher stakes because they don't have as much resources to adapt to decisions that are like suboptimal for them. And so I think that this is a real problem, and I don't think that we can like hang our hats on the idea of assuming it away. And so we're going to proceed in this talk kind of thinking about this problem of like stakes and how it motivates the fact that like voting alone when there are really different stakes can return outcomes that just don't generate a lot of value for the population. Okay. So then the question is like, if we can't just like make assumptions on the utilities that fixes the problem, the question is like, if you could talk to everyone in this community, like what would you say? If you saw this election happening and you had a sense that maybe like the utilities kind of looked like this and you were worried that the community was going to choose bus stop A, even though like it's not really that high value of a decision, like what would you say to people? Does anybody have any ideas? This is kind of an open-ended question, but.
Costs 3 epsilon to vote.
Okay, so in order to say that, yes, okay, if you knew the exact utilities of people, you could develop a pricing mechanism. This is something that a lot of people come up with. In practice, we would not know the exact utilities. We might have some impression that there will be a lot of people who are kind of indifferent. But okay, good. Yep, that would work if you knew the utilities. Another thing you can do if you don't really know the utilities is you can appeal to altruism and basically kind of say to everyone, hey, like, I know that some of you might not really care about this decision that much, but there are these people right around the bus stop B that would really, really benefit from this bus stop. And just kind of alert people of the fact that maybe they should be thinking about other people in how they vote. And so this is like a conceptual idea. And if we think about what's going to happen, let's say that like people of type 1 and type 3, they hear this, and a lot of them think to themselves, well, I guess I don't really care that much. Maybe I'll just vote in favor of type B, and suddenly a lot of the rankings that place A ahead of B are switched, and B could win the election then, or at least things would shift in that direction. And so at least in this example, we see that if people are like sort of conceptually more altruistic, it's going to be more likely that we end up with a higher average utility outcome.
Is one way of being altruistic is just not voting if you don't have a serious interest, instead of trying to understand what other people want? Let's say my interest is epsilon, I just vote with probability epsilon.
So I would not, in the language of this paper, I would not call that altruism, but it will actually turn out to have a very similar effect. If, for example, people decide to vote in proportion to what I'm calling their stakes, like if I basically say I'm going to flip a coin and with probability epsilon, if my stakes are epsilon, I'll vote. That will not be shown in this talk. This is actually work that I've done in a paper that will be released very soon. This will also solve the problem, but it's not because it's altruistic. But yeah, great question. That would also fix the problem. And we're going to actually come back to that at the end of the talk. So if you stick around, we'll discuss. Okay, great. Okay, so there's some sort of conceptual idea that increasing voters' altruism can lead to higher utility voting outcomes. And why is this interesting? It's interesting because unlike this condition on the utility matrix, which we can't really control, there's actually existing interventions in the space of how we design democracy that are thought to increase people's altruism and how they make decisions democratically. And in particular, one example of this, and a very prominent example, is deliberation. And the idea is that like basically before people vote, they get together and they discuss the issue with like a diverse group of people in a structured environment where they're sharing experiences and opinions about the issue at hand. And the evidence suggesting that this increases altruism comes from people who run deliberation in democratic settings. It comes from the political theory. And there are also some experiments that sort of show this idea that people tend to be more altruistic in how they think about decisions after deliberation. And so this is really promising. But what we would really like to know is like, does this increased altruism truly improve the utility of voting outcomes always, robustly, et cetera? And so this is the topic of this talk. And this is joint work with Ariel Prakasha, my advisor, and Sven Wang, who's a postdoc at MIT. And in this talk, we're going to do two things. We're first going to model altruistic voters, which is going to get at your question, Omar, like what does it mean for a voter to be altruistic? And then we're going to analyze the distortion under the assumption that voters are to at least some degree altruistic. Okay, so we've talked about voting, and now just to be very clear, we're going to build a little bit on top of this. So instead of doing the standard voting, we're now thinking about what I'm calling deliberative democracy, where before voting, all the voters get together and they discuss the policy issue at hand. And the difference that's going to come out of this in our model is that instead of using the utility order to rank alternatives, voters are going to use what I'm calling the altruism-informed utility order. So we say that voter I has some altruism level, gamma I, which is in 0, 1. The higher that gamma is, the more altruistic they are. And instead of ranking in terms of their utilities, they're going to use their altruism-informed utility, which is this V value here. And so VI of J is their value for alternative J. And it's a convex combination of their own utility and the average utility of the alternative. And this convex combination is weighted by their level of altruism. So you can see for intuition that if they're not at all altruistic, AKA like gamma is 0, we recover the original voting model where they're just voting based on their utilities. And if gamma I is 1, they're purely voting based on the average utility of the alternative. Okay. And so you might be saying, how can they know the average utility? What you should be thinking of is really this process of deliberation is partly causing exposure to like other people's experiences and beliefs and interests. But we're going to address this assumption much later. For now, suspend disbelief and assume that people can like compute this quantity in order to actually be able to rank alternatives in this way. But we'll talk about that because that's a very good question.
And sorry, I know we're going to talk about this later, but like I guess the usual economics defense of sort of thinking about ordinal utility functions instead of like cardinal ones is that it's hard to put like units on utility, like how do my utils compare to your utils? And here, if we have like, if we want to think about a fixed like altruism level gamma, it's like kind of important that my utility is like expressible in the same units as your utility and that I know what those units are. Is that something that I should not worry about?
No, you should. And like I have also worried about this, and I will tell you why I'm still somewhat convinced, at least conceptually. Like this is obviously a theoretical model, so it's going to be like a little bit inaccurate, but there's a few things that I want to say. One of the things that happens during deliberation is your level of like as an individual, as I hear other people talk about how they're affected by things, you sort of, it puts your own utility in perspective in some sense, utility, quote unquote, where like I think maybe at the beginning of deliberation, I think like I have the absolute strongest interest in this issue ever, right? This is this issue that you're talking about where people might have totally different scales of like measuring their own utilities. But then I hear other people's experiences and I'm like, oh, wow, you're actually significantly more affected. So it really gives some perspective. And this will by no means put everything on the same numeric scale exactly. But the other thing I want to say is that our results will be pretty robust in a lot of different ways, really, because what is happening here is not very complicated. As people are tending to account for other people's interests more, they're promoting alternatives in their rankings that are better for the population at large. And this kind of monotonicity will hold mathematically, but I think it also just holds conceptually with this idea that like things should just generally get better as people tend to account for this more. So yeah, does that answer your question kind of?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, great. But yeah, we can totally talk about it more as we go too. Feel free to ask it again if you see another part that's relevant to it. Okay, so then the question is like, does altruism really decrease the distortion? I mean, intuitively, probably yes, right? Because we're promoting these higher average utility alternatives in people's rankings. But we're going to prove it. And this is the math slide of the talk. So hopefully we'll stay together here. So basically, there's this lemma that underlies a fair amount of our upper bounds in the paper. And it's a lemma that gives an upper bound on the distortion of any voting rule that exists. And this upper bound will be in terms of two parameters, gamma min, which is the minimum level of altruism possessed by any voter, and kappa f, which is a property of the voting rules behavior itself. And I'll tell you what it is after we go through the proof, because the proof will make it clear what it is. And I just want to point something out here in this bound. If gamma min is 1, which means that everyone is perfectly altruistic, this bound will give an upper bound on a distortion of 1, which means that if everyone's perfectly altruistic, we're going to choose like the highest welfare alternative. And if gamma min is 0, then this upper bound will be unbounded. And that's basically saying that the bound is vacuous if the least altruistic person has no altruism at all. And we'll show some robustness to this condition a little bit later. Okay, so to give you a little bit of intuition, which should hopefully help explain why people being altruistic can decrease the distortion, we're going to start by fixing a utilities matrix, a level, like a vector of levels of altruism for all voters, and a voting rule F. And these quantities together will imply a winner by the voting rule, right? Because we're going to run our process. We've got these utilities. People are going to rank according to their utilities and their altruism. We're going to run a voting rule, and we're going to get some winner. We're going to let that winner be A prime, and we're going to let A star be the maximum average utility alternative. So that's like the best thing that we could get in this instance. And so to get an upper bound on the distortion in this instance, we really care about upper bounding the ratio of the average utility of A star and the average utility of our winner, A prime. This is just the definition of distortion. Okay, and so in proving this upper bound, we're going to look at a very specific set of voters, which is the voters who rank A prime ahead of A star. If a voter ranks A prime ahead of A star, it means that they have higher altruism-informed value or utility for A prime than they do for A star. And this is useful because it's going to imply a lower bound automatically on the average utility of A prime. And so to see this, I've written out the expression for the value of A prime and the value of A star, and I've dropped one of the terms on the right-hand side because we don't need it for the bound to be tight. So we've just like slightly loosened the inequality, no problem. Okay, and so to get the upper bound we want, basically one of two things will have to be true based on this inequality. In case 1, this right-hand term here, U bar A prime, is going to have to be at least half. Either this term is half of the right-hand side, in which case we get the bound we want immediately, or the left-hand term is greater than or equal to 1/2 the right-hand side. And what this means in the second case is that we immediately have some lower bound on the utility that person I has for A prime, right? And so if this person has some lower bounded utility for A prime, and there's enough people who are in this group that we're analyzing, there's enough I's such that they rank A prime ahead of A star, and all of their utilities for A prime are lower bounded, we're going to again get a lower bound on the average utility of A prime. And so in either case, we can deduce a lower bound on the average utility of A prime relative to the average utility of A star. And this is really how we get the upper bound here. Okay. And so then what does this mean for this kappa F? Well, intuitively, our voting rule is going to have a better bound here if there are more voters who rank A prime ahead of A star, AKA who like rank the winner ahead of the highest welfare alternative. And this is a property of the voting rule, right? Because, for example, if this group is size 0, the voting rule is going to be like doing something really weird, right? Because it's going to be saying, look, A star was ranked ahead of A prime by everyone, but we still chose A prime as the winner. So that would be like a pretty weird voting rule. So we kind of expect that like reasonable voting rules will have some lower bound on the number of voters who have to rank A prime ahead of A star. Kappa F is that parameter. It's the minimum number of or fraction of voters who have to rank the winner ahead of any other alternative pairwise. Okay, and so this is the upper bound that we get on all voting rules. Okay, and so we can apply this upper bound to analyze like voting rules of interest. And this is the first theorem. So we find that if all voters are at all altruistic, so gamma min is like bigger than 0, many voting rules will have bounded distortion, and some voting rules will even have constant distortion. And what I mean by constant here is that they're constant in M, the number of alternatives. And this is like the standard asymptotic parameter that we study in the voting literature when we're looking at distortion. So this is like a kind of a theoretical notion of constant. We can talk about the practical implications of the bounds in a second, but just to give you like a little bit of intuition about why even a small amount of altruism is going to help us, let's return to our example. So our example was really bad because we have people who can be really indifferent. But if we think about what's going to happen if people of type 3, say, become even slightly altruistic, they're going to very quickly, if you look at our model in the corner, pretty soon that second, when we're looking at their value for alternative B, the second term of their value, if the level of altruism is even a constant, is going to make their whole value for B a constant, right? Because B's average utility is also a constant. And their value for A under this level of altruism is going to remain very small, like some function of epsilon. And so very quickly, with like a very small amount of altruism, they're going to shift from voting like for A to B. And this is exactly the intuition that we were thinking about at the beginning, where we were like, these people of type 3 are probably going to be like, oh, I'm pretty indifferent, I guess I'll just vote for B, right? It doesn't take much to convince them because they're actually so indifferent. And so having this level of altruism kind of short circuits our ability to build these examples that give really, really high distortion. And to be a little bit more specific about what we get for sort of sensible voting rules that have reasonable values of its kappa F parameter, some voting rules of interest across the top here are minimax, Borda, and plurality for those of you who work with voting rules. And we kappa F for these voting rules is 1 over m, and so we get the bound here implied by the upper bound on the previous slide. Perhaps like slightly more interesting is that for some rules we actually get constant distortion, where again the constant is an m, and this is kind of like the holy grail in the distortion literature, like to remove this dependency on m. And so we can actually recover this, although of course you can see that this is very much dependent on gamma min. So as gamma min goes to 0, this bound is still very large, and so we would like our gamma min to be pretty high in order for this to be like a good bound. And I want to point out that these are exactly type bounds, like up to all constants. So we analyze like several voting rules exactly in terms of the parameter gamma min. And so you can, another like observation that you can see from these bounds is that as gamma min increases, the distortion given by these upper bounds is going to decrease, which is good. That's like a nice form of monotonicity. But monotonicity in the minimum level of altruism is kind of weak. What we would really like to know is that if like what's going on above the minimum, right? Like if we have all these people at different levels of altruism and one of them increases their level of altruism, do we still see a decrease in distortion? And for some voting rules, the answer is actually yes. So we also prove this notion of monotonicity, which is exactly like what I just described. And conveniently, Copeland, one of the rules that gets really like good constant distortion in the previous bound, also has this property of monotonicity. Okay, so now let's talk about robustness, because we've made like a fair amount of assumptions here, and we really are hoping that this finding is somewhat practicable, right? Like we're hoping that in a real setting where people are deliberating, that the kind of increases in altruism that we see are actually going to help us. So we have two kinds of robustness here. First, we have robustness to a non-altruistic contingent. And what that means is that if some people refuse to become altruistic, we can tolerate that up to some like fraction of the population being non-altruistic. We can just lose a constant in proportion to the size of that contingent. If that contingent gets too big, we can immediately recover worst case examples. And so we give the threshold in the paper. I think a more interesting kind of robustness, which Aaron gets at your question, is robustness to voters misestimating the average utilities. So like in the process of deliberation, there's a sense in which people will sort of learn over time a better and better understanding of how different alternatives will benefit or not benefit the population at large. But we cannot expect these estimates to be accurate. And what we would be worried about is that maybe even slight errors in this quantity could really change the election in some cases, because a voter has a slight error, it switches a ranking or it switches a pairwise ranking in the ranking they submit, and it changes the outcome of the election. But fortunately, we don't see that. Actually, our results are quite robust. So if we allow voters to have errors of delta, where we're thinking of delta as greater than or equal to 1. And we can express like any pattern of errors that way by just rescaling the utilities. Just basically, we can spread these errors as adversarially as we want over voters' estimates of the average utilities of alternatives. So you can say like, okay, population A is really biased against population B. They're like consistently underestimating the average utility of the alternative that they really want. However adversarially you want, we're going to lose a factor of plus delta in our distortion upper bounds. And I have a proof of this on an extra slide if you're interested in seeing it. It's like actually quite cute. But to move on to the takeaways here, even a little bit of altruism can be really valuable, but more is better. And it doesn't have to be perfect to actually help. And for these reasons, this is like making a fair amount of headway, in my opinion, toward evidencing this point that increased altruism, even of the kind that can be promoted in practice, can be really valuable in generating higher utility voting outcomes. And this is consistent with like a lot of conceptual ideas from the political theory and people who actually work on deliberation. Like if you talk to them, one of the first things they'll say if you ask them why is deliberation good is that it increases people's like ability and willingness to think about other people and how they contribute to collective decisions. And so the implication of our work is really that implication, which has been conjectured by many people, but it provides some formal evidence. And this I think is kind of nice because in TCS, like it's not always obvious how to use TCS to study these really real political systems that involve people. But this edge on the right here that we've studied is really hard to study in practice because you can't observe people's utilities. So it would be really hard to experimentally test this because you see the outcome of a vote, but you can't really observe the counterfactual. And so this is like, I think one of my takeaways from this project is that this is a really nice role of theory, is like looking at these stages in the process that are really like, you can't study them with experiments because you can't observe counterfactuals. Okay, speaking of experiments, what I think this really motivates is more targeted experiments of exactly how deliberation increases altruism. And like one example of what I mean by that is like, we're hoping that people throughout the process of deliberation learn about the average utilities. And so sort of trying to actually get at this by surveying people and trying to understand how their opinions are changing with this exact model in mind, I think would be like quite interesting and add a lot to the existing experiments, which are just much more conceptual at this point. Okay, so to recap, we talked about voting and we raised some concerns about how sometimes it will produce outcomes that don't generate a lot of value. We talked about adding this deliberation stage and how it can help us. But one problem in like running experiments and also just deploying deliberation in general is that often if you look at this right or the left-hand side, this group of voters that we're hoping are going to deliberate could be enormous, right? It could be a whole country, it could be a whole state. There's no way that we can get all these people in one room to talk to each other. And so one solution for this that has been proposed is a citizens assembly, which basically what it does is it randomly subsamples the population, produces this like smaller panel, which is usually about like size 100 or something. And then that panel deliberates and makes some collective decision. And you can imagine that this first stage of the sampling process is like extremely important, right? Because you want everyone in the population to feel that the decision that comes out at the end is legitimate. And so you need to make sure that this panel satisfies various things. In particular, in practice, people want demographic representation of the population. And they also want to make sure that people are given like pretty equal probability of being chosen for the panel. And I think that this is a really exciting application that's already being deployed around the world in which to study these dynamics of deliberation. And I've already worked in this area some amount. And so I've been chatting with some practitioners actually about this kind of thing related to studying altruism and deliberation. But these are some of my wonderful collaborators who also work on citizens assemblies. I think that this is just in general, based on what we've talked about today about the value of deliberation, a really exciting way of making democratic decisions. And I'm happy to talk about this with anyone if they want to talk about it. Okay, so this is like really the end of the talk. I just want to leave you with like one idea that motivates the work that's coming up related to this idea of like, what if people decided to vote based on how high their stakes were? And this is a question that actually alludes to a much more general idea, which is like, how should we even be accounting for stakes in democracy? So let's say, you know, we've worked our way down, we got to citizens' assemblies. Let's say that we actually ran a citizens' assembly in our little neighborhood here. What would the resulting panel of deliberators look like if it was going to be demographically representative? Well, one really natural like feature of demographic representation that's used in practice a lot and would probably be used here given the importance of geography is geographic representation. So making sure that people, we have like sort of population balanced representation of people from different regions. What would happen though is like, this is the panel of deliberators that we have. And the question is like, is this good? Does this look like a good panel for deliberation? Does anybody have any thoughts on this? Feel free to share them. Okay. Well, I don't know is the answer. I mean, this is like kind of the gold standard, right? This like demographic representation. But what if instead we decided to represent people by their frequency of taking the bus, which kind of makes sense because we're deciding where to put a bus stop. So it would make sense to kind of overrepresent people who tend to take the bus way more. And what would ultimately happen maybe is like, this is more what our panel would look like. And, you know, maybe there's heterogeneity in type 1 and type 3, and it wouldn't be quite this extremely yellow. But like what we would see is that like we would have a much higher representation of this group of people who really tends to take the bus.
Just
and
to like
what I'm gonna
interject something that maybe is not what you intended, where you intended this to go, but like I would be concerned that if we represented people by their frequency of taking the bus, we would be overrepresenting people who live near bus stops. And the whole point is to like build bus stops near people who don't already live near bus stops and might therefore take the bus less.
100%. Okay, so yes, somebody brought this up last time I used this example as well. This is a flaw in the example that you're pointing out. We're kind of assuming that like the people, we're making the assumption here that the people of type 2 have like just basically inelastic demand for taking the bus, and they will just walk really, really far to get to the bus. But you're absolutely right. Like using the data to actually evaluate people's stakes in the problem has this exact issue of like bias. So totally right. Great point. Yeah. Okay, so we're suspending disbelief. The data is correct. Maybe we don't even like, yeah, okay. Okay, so the point that I'm making though, is that this idea, even though it deviates from demographic representation, doesn't really seem that crazy, at least to me. And roughly what I'm gonna call this is like stakes-based representation, where you're somehow trying to represent people in proportion to their actual stakes in the decision. And so you can think about this as like arising sort of naturally from certain models, like if people decide to participate in proportion to their stakes, then you would end up with exactly stakes-based representation. But you can also think about like inducing it through different democratic mechanisms. Like quadratic voting, while it doesn't like think about this model exactly, I think the idea does something kind of similar, where it basically forces people to trade off between weighing in on different issues. And the idea is that people are going to then avoid wasting their power on issues where they really have like nothing to lose their gain. And so stakes is like a framework to think about why this kind of mechanism can actually increase the social welfare of like systems. And so I'll just leave you with this question, like, how should collective decision-making processes account for stakes? This is a very rich question because how do you even measure stakes? How do people evaluate their own stakes? There's all kinds of different questions here. So stay tuned for our next paper on this, but I'm happy to talk about it now. And with that, I will just post the summary here and conclude the talk. And I think we have like 10 minutes for questions. So yeah. Thank you for coming.
Cool. Maybe one quick question that maybe maybe you answered at the beginning. I had to join a little late. So when I had sort of jokingly suggested that maybe we should like just charge people 3 epsilon to vote, and this would solve your example, Like, maybe it's not entirely different from what happens now, which is that, you know, like, even in pretty important elections, like, quite far from everyone in the United States votes. And maybe one way to explain that is there's some, you know, labor cost involved in voting, and like, so only people who like care enough to make up for needing to like trudge out to the voting booth actually vote. So I guess my question is, do these same results where you have sort of unbounded, the result of the voting process can be sort of unboundedly far from socially optimal, do those still hold when there's, you know, some epsilon cost for voting?
So yes, okay, I have a few things to say about this. The first thing is that I don't think, so you're absolutely right that not everybody votes, but I definitely do not, in my opinion, think that the people who are not voting are the people with very low stakes. I think often actually people who are marginalized are prevented from voting at higher rates because they can't take time off work, or they're like literally being subjected to like laws that make it harder for them to vote. And I think,
Right.
so
there
maybe,
might be both
okay, so
differing
that's
stakes and different
right.
costs.
Totally. And so I don't think we see this in practice. And also people can be like motivated to vote through like very mechanisms completely unrelated to their own interests, right? Like, for example, like polarization and like all this really like emotionally reactive rhetoric that goes on in the media, like can motivate whole groups of people to turn out to the polls and vote in a certain way that has very little to do with their actual interests, which is where I think this kind of bias can that's one source of the bias that I'm talking about. If
Although
you were
presumably
to,
like they
yeah.
think it's in their interest. Like it's,
Sure.
I'm hesitant to say, look, you guys are voting according to the wrong utility function.
Totally, right, exactly. I'm not saying that they're voting against their interests. I'm just saying that you can, for people who really don't have like a lot to lose or gain from a decision, you can still see these sort of correlations between people's behavior, like through these kinds of like sort of media-based mechanisms and other things. But you're right, it's a very complicated question. And I don't think the example at the beginning was like good enough to like really capture that. But the other question that you said is like, would an epsilon price address this? It's really like a question of like, how would you set the price? Because like, if you can set a threshold and then you'll basically get nobody below that threshold will vote, presumably, if they don't have like high enough stakes in the decision. It also really depends on how you're like measuring stakes, which is like a whole other question. But if you were able to set this price, you would just basically get a distortion that's parameterized by the price, because you're basically saying like, what is the minimum amount that people can gain from that will still result in them voting. Yeah.
Got it. Thanks.
Yeah.
This is really cool. Great presentation, Billy. If I can ask a question, I'm curious about sort of cases when you move away from the mean. So for example, can you do better if, for example, some people when being altruistic consider the sort of worst off person? And can you do worse if like as a society, we care not about like average utility, but something different? Does that make sense?
Super good question. So this was originally the model that we were actually thinking of, where people are all using like different welfare functions, and you're kind of want to see what happens, like if people like become more altruistic with respect to their own welfare function. I have no idea what happens when some people do that. Like there are certain measures of welfare where the results would be a bit weird. I think, like for example, Nash welfare, I think might turn out to be a bit weird because in some sense, like Nash is multiplying all the utilities together. And so you lose this, in some sense, you lose the difference of stakes, kind of. And so I don't know what would happen is the short answer, but you should study it and let me know, or maybe I will in 5 years when I'm done with my stake stuff. Anyway, yeah, it's a really good question.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
I have a question about the future work part.
The which part?
The future one that you
Sure.
join with proportional to stake. In some sense, if you can like approximate the stake of every group, doesn't it mean you've already solved the problem in a way? Because you know, if you know that group V has higher stake, doesn't it just mean that you know they have higher value? You can take this value into account in your voting rule, not like a binary voting rule, and then you solved it.
Yeah, so it's not obvious that if you were, let's say you were able to know people's stakes. So first of all, that would require knowing how to measure people's stakes, which is really complicated when you have more than two alternatives, because there can be like intermediate values. But let's say you knew how to measure it, and then you were to do some kind of weighted voting rule. It's not obvious that this solves it technically, but in fact it does, which is like the work that I'm doing now. But the other thing is like, whether people would view that democratic decision as legitimate, right? Because if you've reweighted people, that can be really complicated. And so if you want to enact this in practice, I think a more viable way of really accounting for stakes, quote unquote, is to either do some kind of like selection mechanism like this, where you're compiling a decision-making body and you're defining representation according to stakes, or you build some mechanism where people are making active decisions and trading off where to weigh in, which will have a similar effect, but you won't be saying, I'm just going to give these people more power. Yeah, but
Yeah.
It would solve the problem though. Yeah.
Yeah, I was more thinking in like asking different questions and what you would prefer. Say, how frequently would you use a bus station if it is on place A or B? And using this kind of things to approximate stakes, but also to do the decision, like to choose the value and then do the decision.
Yeah, you're right. You're totally right. If you could do that, then the problem would be solved. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, cool.
Are there more questions for Bailey? If not, I'll stop recording. Thanks for the great talk, Bailey. Thanks for joining.